Hi everybody, and welcome to the nCircle VERT Patch Tuesday Roundup. We're going to take a look at this month's advisories. I'm Tyler Reguly, Technical Manager, Security R&D, and this is my boss.
I'm Oliver Lavery, the Director of Security R&D here at nCircle. So let's see, Tyler, what do we have this week? We've got MS10-061, the vulnerability in the print spooler service.
Yeah, this one's actually interesting because it came out of some joint research that involved the Microsoft MAP program. And it's actually a vulnerability exploited by Stuxnet to spread once it is inside of a network.
And really, what's the significance of this for the end user? I mean, I guess users, might have a printer share, but they're not going to have a whole lot of hostile people on their network who are likely to exploit it.
Really, the only significance is the malware, and it primarily affects Windows XP. You need to meet a certain set of circumstances if you're dealing with anything other than Windows XP. So probably the only place you're going to see this even effective for Stuxnet is when you're starting to deal with college residences and post-secondary residences.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Large, untrusted networks that might be running obsolete versions of Windows. Well, older versions of Windows, we'll say. All right, well, let's move on to MS10-062, the vulnerability in the MPEG-4 codec. That one sounds pretty nasty to me, right?
Yeah, you could throw that into the general drive-by download, just visit a web page type of thing.
Yeah, and to clarify, MPEG-4 is used fairly ubiquitously in AVI videos, Windows Media videos. It can be encapsulated as a codec within all kinds of different streaming and static video content. So, this is potentially a fairly nasty one.
It's definitely all over the place.
Yeah. Now, are there any specific mitigating factors even?
None that I can think of off the top of my head. It's one of those things where, browse and you're owned.
Yeah. So we'll probably see that one exploited in the wild in short order. Spammers, that kind of scenario. So let's talk about MS10-063, the Unicode scripts processor. So this is really with open type fonts, right? Yeah,
so you're looking at, and this is actually an interesting one for a lot of enterprises to keep in mind. There's actually 2 patches to be applied for this one, because you have to patch Microsoft Windows, but you also have to patch Office. So you've got 2 patches applied to one system. Because both are affected.
And OpenType, it's not really that common, but it's supported in a huge number of different applications at this point.
Yeah, you can embed it in any document, any third-party documents, third-party applications, and you can embed it in a website.
Yep.
So it is a core part of Windows functionality that's sitting there.
Yeah, it's another potential web drive-by, vector.
Most definitely.
So 2 pretty nasty ones this month. So MS10-064, the vulnerability in Microsoft Outlook. Now this sounds pretty nasty on the surface of things, right? But we were talking about this earlier and you're saying it's actually not that big a deal.
Yeah, when you think about it, first of all, POP3 and IMAP are off the board. So any home user who bought Office and is running Outlook kind of out of the picture as far as they go. And when you're looking at an enterprise, both Outlook 2003 and 2007 used cached exchange mode, which isn't affected. This is only exchange in online mode.
Which is really a less practical way of configuring Exchange in general, right? Because it means you only really have access to your email when you're connected to the corporate internet, the corporate intranet.
Yeah.
So MS10-065, moving down the list. This is the IIS one, and this one does sound pretty bad, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. You'll actually notice it's fairly low on Microsoft's list if you start reading through their prioritization of them. There are 3 of them. This is actually the only advisory with more than 1 CVE this month. So nine advisories this month, but there's only 11 CVEs. And if you break this one down, I guess we can talk about each one.
Yeah.
We have a denial of service, a buffer overflow, and an elevation of privilege, or authentication bypass. Mm-hmm. So we might as well start with the authentication bypass, simply because it amuses me. For anybody who was around in the 90s and remembers the alternate data stream, it's back.
Yeah.
You can use it to bypass authentication and execute ASP scripts.
Now let's walk through what an exploit scenario would be for that.
Sure. I'm trying to think of a web application that's going to be running ASP, but any sort of back-end management scripts for your web application that you'd think are behind a login, you now no longer have the protection of that login to access them.
Yeah, ASP is still commonplace, right?
It is.
Not to be confused with ASP.NET, which is obviously more common now, but ASP is still all over the web. So, that's a fairly significant thing.
Yeah, most definitely.
All right. Now, moving on to the second one.
So I guess next, if we just talk about the DOS briefly, it's a denial of service. Most people don't care about denial of service these days.
In the web
I
world,
do.
Though, it's a little bit more
I
significant,
still
right?
consider it to be a pretty major issue, but it's going to be one that when you prioritize these, the denial of service is definitely going to fly under most people's radar.
Yeah.
And it affects a lot of the older versions of IIS. It's sort of the across-the-board one out of this advisory, leading into the most important of the three, which is the buffer overflow. It only affects IIS 7.5, so we're talking Windows 7 and Server 2008 R2. And it specifically involves HTTP headers with relation to fast CGI and the fast CGI handler.
Maybe we should talk for a second about what fast CGI is, right? Because a lot of people don't know fast CGI or haven't heard of it. I mean, it's a big technology back in 1995 or 6, but it's still around today.
Yep. And if you're using, I don't want to call them, open source necessarily, but in most cases, open source technologies is where you see them. Things like PHP, Perl, those web scripting languages that are usually more commonly found on the Linux side. When you start running those under IIS, you need the fast CGI handler as a plug-in to actually operate them within IIS.
And it gives you the performance you'd get of something like ISAPI without the need to use a actual proprietary vendor plug-in model, right? So it's faster than CGI, not quite as fast as a plug-in, but a good moderate solution.
Yeah, and so essentially you're looking at IIS 7.5 with one of these languages installed, because you have to have a page that gets processed, and you're looking at a vulnerability that leads to a buffer overflow. And the real problem here is that while it seems like it's minimal, think of all of the hosting providers that are out there that offer shared Windows hosting, where PHP and Perl come by default even on their IIS offerings.
It's not even that uncommon for big public websites running on IIS to be using PHP or Perl, right?
That's true as well.
I mean, it's maybe not the most advisable or the most optimal solution, but I've certainly seen enterprise, internet-facing enterprise websites that use one of those two languages.
Yep.
All right, that covers those three. How about MS 10-066, the vulnerability in RPC? Now, this one actually isn't that big a deal, right? Because it requires, well, a user-initiated connection.
Yeah, I would probably rank this fairly low, maybe the lowest. Hard to say for sure, though. Yeah. But you're talking about a client making an RPC connection out either directly to a malicious server or perhaps in a man-in-the-middle.
So even though it's remote code execution, there's actually a fair bit of, well, user interaction, if you want to say, although in this case it's system interaction maybe, involved before this can be exploited, which I guess is why Microsoft's only rated it important, even though it's one of the big scary remote code executions. Now, how about MS 10-067, the vulnerability in WordPad? Now, this doesn't sound like a big deal, you might think, right? Because who uses WordPad?
Yeah, what's interesting here, so it's specifically in the Word 97 converter, so we're talking about doc files. And WordPad, if you don't have Office installed, WordPad is actually the default for opening doc files. So, okay, in an enterprise on most desktops you'll find Office, at the home on most desktops you find Office.
What everyone would assume, right?
Yeah, but what about on servers? How many people have Office installed on their server?
In fact, probably against best practices to install Office
exactly.
on servers.
So in that case, WordPad is actually going to be opening any doc files.
Yeah, so sysadmins could actually get bit in the butt by this one. MS 10-068, vulnerability in LSAS.
Here we have an elevation of privilege. It's remote, however you have to have credentials. Requires an authenticated user, and yes, it's serious. You're looking at Active Directory, and anytime you're talking about dealing with Active Directory, you get those two big words, which are insider and threat, and that's really probably your biggest attack vector here.
And where it becomes a really big deal is on shared systems, right, where people are using something like Citrix to allow multiple people to log into a system that they think is jailed because they don't have administrator privileges or they have very restricted privileges. Well, with this, pretty easily you can take over control of that shared system, which in that scenario is probably a fairly important system.
Yeah, or to even go back to the post-secondary, it's September, everyone's going back to school right now. Libraries that are on the domain, you walk in to use the computer and it's a shared login because people are sitting down at it all day long.
Very good point. And last but, well, actually maybe least, MS 10-069, the vulnerability in the Windows client-server runtime subsystem.
Yeah. Probably the big thing to say here is that your system locale has to be Chinese, Japanese, Korean. You're looking at a subset of operating systems, even within the Windows XP in 2003 install base, that are actually affected by this.
Granted, though, I mean, Asia is a pretty big subset.
It is. It's a very large subset, but I would also expect that a large chunk of that subset is running English versions of Windows.
Yeah, that's true. Indeed. All right, well, I think that pretty much wraps it up for this week. Thanks, Doll.
Thank you.